Hello and welcome to Make Me a Card Maker video number 4. Hopefully you've enjoyed the previous 3 videos and you've learned lots of new tips and techniques and you're well on your way to becoming an experienced card maker. So what we're going to do now is round off with this final video showing you how to do embossing with some stamps, how to create your own card bases that are a little bit different to the ones we've looked at already, and how to finish building your cards up. So you're going to be making extraordinary cards that are absolutely unique, and you won't need to hopefully refer back to these now because you've followed along with the previous steps. If you have missed any of these videos though, they are all on craftworld.com. You can go back and see number 1 through to number 3 leading up to this part, because I will be referring to techniques in this video that we have covered in previous ones. So let's get started with heat embossing. Now I've first of all got a stamp. We need a stamp to be able to do heat embossing, although not essential. That's going more into the advanced techniques with embossing powder. But what is heat embossing? What we usually do is we will stamp an image, and I've got a birthday stamp here that I'll be using, and we'll stamp it in a very sticky ink. So this is a clear ink that stays wet for a very long time, so it won't dry for a long time. And then what we do is we apply embossing powder to that clear ink, and then we heat it. And this powder is created so that it will melt under extreme heat, and it will form almost like an enamel. Okay, and then you've got a beautiful metallic or shiny glossy surface where you've stamped. Okay, so that's the very basics of heat embossing. So you will need embossing powder. Glitter will not work. It does need to be an embossing powder. There's lots and lots on the market, lots of different brands, lots of different colours, lots of different thicknesses and finishes as well. Lots of these different styles of embossing powder are covered in a particular video on Craft World. If you look up the brand of Wow, I've gone through lots of different embossing powder, different styles, different types and different techniques as well. So go look for that after you've seen this video. Then you need an embossing ink, and this is, like I say, that very sticky ink to hold on to the embossing powder. I love this one, Versamark. It's extremely sticky, stays wet for a long time, gives you time to work with your embossing powder. There are others on the market. There is a Wow brand, there is a Ranger brand, there is most companies who do coloured ink pads will have an embossing ink version of their ink as well, okay, and it's usually clear, although you can use other types of ink as well. So for example, pigment ink, if you see a pigment ink on your embossing or rather on your ink pad, that will usually hold your powder long enough to melt it too. So there's different options for you. This little bag here is an anti-static bag. It's filled with anti-static powder. We'll use that. It's not an essential, but I do absolutely recommend it. We'll go through that in a moment. And you do need a heat tool for the embossing. You can't use a hairdryer, despite this one looking a little bit like a travel hairdryer. It is not. It's a tool particularly for heat embossing. It is giving out an extreme heat, much hotter than your hairdryer will get, but in a much gentler flow, so it won't blow the particles around. And then of course you need a stamp to get started. I'm going to be embossing onto vellum. You can emboss onto lots of different surfaces. Really anything you can stamp onto, for the most part you can emboss onto, as long as the material will handle the heat. So let's get started and talk you through the steps. So I've got my stamp here, and I'm just going to put my stamp onto my platform there, and you can use an acrylic block like this one here if you prefer. I'm going to just secure down my vellum into my stamping platform with the magnets. I'm going to fold that over and make sure that's on there. It doesn't need to be perfectly straight because I'm actually going to be cutting this out. If you are going to be embossing onto a panel of cardstock that you're not cutting out, make sure it's central before you use your stamping platform. The best way to do that is to actually pop that onto the paper and then pick it up with your platform. Bear in mind that's going to be sticky. Now, this particular stamp is a brand new one, and you can see there it's got a tackiness to it from the manufacturing process, so it's lifting up my vellum there. So what we're going to do is 2 things. First of all, we're going to apply the anti-static bag, and I like to do a few little taps to release some powder and then give it a rub all over, and this takes the static out of the vellum or the parchment or the paper, the cardstock, whatever you're using there to stamp onto. And then I take an eraser. This is just a pencil eraser. I've got a nice large flat one, and I'm going to just brush over the surface of the stamp. You only need to do this stage if your stamp is brand new. This takes that surface off, and this means your ink will stick to it nicely. And if you see now, when I put that over, that's not sticking now. Okay, it's taken that stickiness away. Now we want to add the stickiness back in, of course, but only where we want it. So I'm going to take my clear ink and I'm going to just dab onto my stamp all over. Because it's a clear ink, it is a little harder to see exactly where you're putting the ink. So a nice good coating is perfect. There we go. Sometimes if you hold your stamp up to the light, if you angle it, for example, you can see where the wetness is, where you've got the ink applied. Now, before I go to the next stage, I'm going to bring in another tool that I failed to mention earlier, and that is a tidy tool. It may be called lots of different things. It's a tidy tray. We've got them on Craft Stash. They're part of the Essentials range. I use mine all the time for embossing and for working with glitter and beads. So now we're going to do our stamping, just pressing all over the image there. Now, much as you would with a coloured stamp, you can have a look at your image and you can see whether you've got it perfectly stamped. You can just see it's darker there. It's a clear ink, so again, you may have to angle your material to see where the ink has applied. If in doubt, just go over and do it again, the same as you would if you were stamping in colour. So I'll just go over once more to ensure we've got a nice even application of ink and all of the areas of that stamp are covered. And then I'm going to remove this. Now just be aware that your fingers will be oily just from natural oils, so you don't really want to touch anywhere near your stamping. Let's pop this to the side. Okay, and we're going to, just capturing the edges of this, going to pop that into the tidy tray, and we're going to sprinkle on the embossing powder. Now the idea with a tidy tray is that you can then put the excess powder back into the pot. So really a small pot like this is going to last you a long time. So sprinkling that all over my image, and then I'm just going to tap it off, and you can see it's stuck beautifully where I want it to. And I can now take the lid off of this funnel and pour this back in. Now if you don't have a tidy tray, or you're waiting for yours to be delivered, if you've ordered yourself one, you can use a piece of paper for this. Just tip it off into a piece of paper, make a fold in it and funnel it back into your pot. But you don't really want to waste any if you can help it. Okay, now this is where the magic happens. This ink will remain wet for quite a while, so you don't need to rush this part. Just ensure there's no little granules of embossing powder anywhere where there shouldn't be, and this is going to be the case if you've got oily fingers and you did press on your paper somewhere, hold your paper, pick it up like so, left a bit of a thumbprint, sometimes the powder will stick to that. You can take something like a small brush and just brush away any excess. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to heat this. Now you can heat it from above if you want to, but I suggest if you can, heat it from below, because this just gives you a more even finish. Now I'm holding it a couple of inches away from the paper and just allow it to warm up, and as you can see there straight away, because we've got a nice thin material that we're going through, the heat's coming through and it's melting the embossing powder into a beautiful metallic enamel. So just move it around, don't hold it on any one area too much or for too long, and once it's melted, move on to the next stage. Okay, working your way round. Just don't allow the paper to get too hot. You're just melting that powder, and like I say, then you're moving on. And I'm turning it round so I don't burn my fingers, and I can just do up where this B is as well, because my fingers were quite close to there. I didn't want to do that bit. There we go, beautiful. And we've got a nice smooth enamel there. So as you could hear, that heat tool there, it's not like a hairdryer, it's not particularly noisy. The flow of the air is reasonably slow, but it's very, very hot. So you do need to use a heat tool rather than a hairdryer. And that is your embossing. Now that already is cool, dry, and you can work with it, whether you want to go and add ink on it and use that, because that will resist ink now, a water-based ink. that will resist. So you can go and add inks into that if you wanted to. You can cut this out. So what I'm going to do for this particular card is I'm actually going to cut around this, and we're going to place this on our card at the very end. But now I'm going to move on to another stage of this Make Me a Card Maker video, and we're going to look at creating our own unique shaped cards. So we've seen square cards on the market, we've seen square bases, we've looked at rectangle bases as well, and we know we can buy some different shapes and styles, such as, for example, gatefolds. But how do you create one? Maybe you want to have a circle or a hexagon or a star-shaped card. You can find them to buy sometimes, but it's very, very inexpensive and quick to make your own. So I'm going to show you how to create a shaped card base. Now I'm going to take a square card base to start with, and this is the size or slightly larger than the shape that I want, and I'm going to use nesting dies. Now we did talk about die cutting and what sort of dies are available on the market in a previous video. I believe it was video 3, so go and take a look at that. So what I've got is some shapes that I could potentially make my card into. I'm going to show you for this card how to make it into the octagon. Okay, so I'm going to take one of the nesting dies. This one actually has a stitched detail to it, so it's really pretty. Now we're going to tape this to the front of our card base, and we are going to die cut through both the front and the back. If I turn this over before sticking it down, you'll notice we've got the cut edge there of the die, and I'm actually going to place this just outside of the folded part of the card, the folded edge. So if I just show you, that's what I'd call the spine or the folded edge, and I'm going to place the die just over that so that that part of the card will not cut. So hopefully you can just see the cutting edge is sitting just outside. So if you're happy with that and you're happy with the position, you can now use a repositionable tape to tack that down. So just again, make sure that cutting edge is over the edge and pop this down like so. 2 pieces will be plenty. Now I'm going to run that through my die cutting machine. This is going to be quite hard to get through because we're going through 2 layers of a 300 GSM cardstock. Okay, so you're going to want to use the best machine you've got to hand. Make sure, of course, that your machine, mine's a little bit dirty at the minute, but make sure your machine is big enough, of course, for your nesting dies. And if we just pop this in, you're going to want to run it backwards and forwards a few times, and you may need to turn it. So we are going through 2 layers of cardstock here. Sometimes you'll take this out, it won't have quite cut through. You can put it back in if you need to. So I've released my card after running it through a couple of times. I've released that from the die, and as you can see, this edge that was overhanging the card over this fold there, the spine didn't cut through. So now I've got a card base that is shaped the right way. Now you may notice that I've got a little bit of tearing on the front of my card here. This is because the low tack tape I didn't prime before I put on. If you just pop that onto the material of your clothes before you put it on, just to loosen the tack even further when it's brand new, that will help prevent that from happening. But I'm not worried about this because I'm going to be covering it over with mats and layers and such anyway. But that's how we create a card base when you've got a straight edge to go against. But what if you don't have a straight edge? So what you can also do is use things like a circle, for example, and you can overhang that straight edge a little bit. I would suggest overhanging it by at least ½ centimetre. Die cut your card, and then what you want to do is recut another one of these in its entirety, so a whole one of these, and glue it to the front, which will just fill in the little gap that you're missing from the shape. And the same for something like a star, for example. So you'll want to overhang one of the points of the star over the spine, die cut everything, and then recut a full star to glue onto the front of the card base. And that's how you create your own card bases. So now for this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the slightly smaller die from the nesting set, the same as the one that I cut the card base from, and I'm going to cut myself a pretty piece of paper. So I've got my pattern paper here, and I'm going to create some mats and layers with this. So I'm just going to angle this just like so. Again, I'm going to tape this down, but I'm going to make sure that the tape I use is firstly on the outside of the paper for where I want to use it. I'm looking at the middle, so I've stuck it to the outside, but also that's an older piece of tape, so that one won't affect this part when I peel it off. And just run that through my die cutting machine. It's only one sheet of paper, so I can just run this through the once. There we go. And that will sit beautifully on the front of my card with that nice bright white border, and then we've got that shaped card there. So this is going to glue on there. Now all I need to do is I need to cut around this gold birthday, which works really well with the gold running through the background paper. So I'm going to take some scissors that they're actually embroidery scissors, but I love them because they have a very sharp point on the end. These ones are from Fiskars. There's lots of different ones on the market, particularly for what we call fussy cutting, and that's what this is. If you're cutting round a detailed piece, we call it fussy cutting. Something like round a stamped image maybe. Once you're doing that, you need your smaller scissors for the detail, so that's what I'm doing, going around here. This one's actually quite easy. It's lots of straight lines, not too many curves or swirls to get round. It's not floral or leafy or anything like that, no organic shapes. So very, very quick to go around, and I'm just leaving myself about 1/4 centimetre border, a few millimetres of a border all the way around. And take your time to do this because you've got that beautiful neat embossing now, so we want to make sure that the cutting and the border is equally as neat and professional looking. So I can glue on my mats and layers, or my mat here, with a wet glue or a foam tape. That's entirely your preference. But because I've heat embossed onto vellum, I'm going to have to be careful about how I adhere this. Now I can apply a wet glue to this if I want to, but with a vellum or a parchment, wet glue will very often show through. It will go almost like a watermark on there. So we want to avoid that. So what I'm going to do is put my wet glue away, and I'm going to find my foam tape. And it's just here, and it's quite a thin foam tape. So certainly for this image, it's perfect. I can apply my foam tape in areas where the heat embossing is, because of course that won't show through the vellum because we've got the embossing on top. So I'm using some of these straight lines here, and if you've got any sort of larger areas on your embossing or on your vellum that are covered over, you can use those for this. I've got part just here, and you don't have to do every single part of embossing on the back here. Just make sure you've got an area on each part, so each of the edges and in the center of your image, and that will be enough to hold it down securely. Okay, because of the vellum being heated, that's given it a little bit of a curve. When we stick this down, this should, for the most part, that curve will flatten out because it will be held nice and flat. But if you need to add additional pieces of foam underneath some of the edges to hold them even flatter, you can do that once it's on, once you see how it's laying naturally, once you've glued it down. Before I stick anything down, I always get into the habit of double checking that I've got the spine in the right place. It may be that you want to have it at the top of your card and have the sentiment on the side. I'm going to have my fold to the side and have the sentiment in the middle. It's entirely your choice. There we go. So I just need to add an additional little bit of foam tape to the edge of this R. It only needs to be a little bit because this is on a curve anyway. So you're going to struggle to put a large piece on there. And try not to fold vellum or parchment if you're using it. Just curl it, because if you fold it, it will leave a white crease in the paper. There we go. So I've got my birthday embossing on there on top of that beautiful sort of geode paper that we've got. It's absolutely stunning. Now I'm just going to finish this off with some embellishments, and those are going to be some gold sequins. So just coming into my embellishment box, I've got lots of little things in here. My sequins are all falling out, so I'm going to take a few of these, and I'm just going to apply them with a little bit of glue in a few areas, not too many, not many at all. And you'll kind of get used to whereabouts to put embellishments like these, but they are the perfect finishing touch for your cards. So there's my finished shaped card. We've got that gorgeous gold embossing on there. We have got the shaped card as well that we've created completely from scratch. We've got a few little sequins on there just to finish off and give it a little more sparkle. You could be making cards like this, and I hope you've enjoyed this Make Me a Card Maker series. Like I say, you can go back and follow any of the previous 3 videos to catch up and refine your skills. But for now, if you've followed all 4 videos, you should be set to go ahead and follow the techniques and the tutorials on Craft World with the basic knowledge that you can create cards like this already.